May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
In the reading from the Gospel of Luke, which we've just heard, Jesus, as is often the case, is surrounded by many people, and someone in that crowd asks him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." Well, it's probably not an unusual question, and it's one that is best answered by an accountant or a lawyer. And so Jesus' answer is, well, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a judge or an arbitrator. This is not my bailiwick. And so we understand that, for we remember that this is Jesus who has said to the people who gather around him, "I have come into the world that you may have life, and that you may have it abundantly." It's not the kind of question or statement that can be answered by a math problem, which in the case of the question asked of Jesus is legacy divided by 2 equals fair shares. Jesus is just saying, that's not the dimensions that I deal with. I'm not concerned with algebra or arithmetic. And he's just concerned with something so much greater. And so Jesus gives us his identity, and which leads to a totally different story, a story that cannot be reduced to a math problem. The riches of this world stay right here. You know that. We've known that forever. And yet, many people, including us, sometimes act as though that were not the case. But therefore, since the things of this world stay right here, Jesus sees the world from a totally different perspective. And his story raises the question, what does it mean to be rich with God? That's a really big question. It does not reduce itself to arithmetic. For God, the Creator, is the only being who can fully take the position of the owner. And we see that in the reading from Hosea, for there the prophet is saying that God, who created all and has called Israel to be his people, is also angry when Israel turns away and is unfaithful. And there's a lot to do with God's judgment in that passage. But ultimately, God says, I can't do that. I can't bring ruin on these people. And God exercises God's love, God's compassion, God's mercy, and brings them to the promised land. So that is the very nature of God. Doesn't fit our usual definition of judgment. Doesn't reduce to just a formula, but is just overwhelmingly loving and giving. And the psalmist says very much the same thing. And so if the nature of the owner is mercy and compassion and just even more creativity, well, then that's who we are. That's the nature of our Creator, and we have been created in God's image. And so we are not owners, but rather we have been blessed with the role of steward. Those who take care of the creation, and the word care is another word for love in its root, and so we are caretakers of creation, which also means of one another. So Jesus has gone on then to tell us a parable, and please note that Jesus is very careful in telling a story. And so this crop that this farmer is harvest is not his own work. For from the very first sentence we are told, the land produced a great crop. And who created the land? And the seeds? And provided the weather? Nourishing rain, we're here this morning. Well, God. And so it really wasn't totally the farmer at all, but many other gifts that were given to him, and even the work of other people. And so we have an example, if we understand farming, to understand the interdependence of creator and creation, of farmer and many other people, and the gifts of nature, and to know that this is actually a simple story that underlies a complex operation. So, blessed with this tremendous harvest, the farmer in this story says, well, what can I do with all this? I'll just tear down my small barns and build great barns and just store it all and live in luxury. So he takes the place of an owner, doesn't he? He's not really being much of a steward, for the mind of a steward would have said, this is a great harvest, and he too could probably have built barns because the crop needs to be protected. But then he might have turned his attention to, well, now that I've stored all this grain, who do I sell it to? Who do I give it to? How do other people benefit for this great harvest? And so that grain would have been distributed and done many people much good, including providing seed grain for another crop. So that is the contrast that underlies this story, for just amassing a fortune in itself has no redemptive value for anybody. Well, that gives us something more to think about, doesn't it? And so we can regard this as the contrast between the ownership for itself, which produces a very static picture in which nothing happens for other people, and the dynamic picture of stewardship, which produces great goodness for God and for humankind and for creation itself. That's a wonderful contrast. It led me to remember that back in the 1990s, one day I happened to open my husband's copy of the alumni magazine from Johns Hopkins University. And some of you know I'm originally from Baltimore, so I take a keen interest in the Johns Hopkins magazine because it's not unusual for me to run into a picture or name of somebody that I'm familiar with. But on this particular day, there was a picture of a man that I hadn't seen in over 30 years. For back when I was a high school student, I babysat for his children. So I thought, Mr. Sheridan, here you are. And what brought him to having his picture in the alumni magazine was that he had given a gift of $20 million to the Johns Hopkins University Library. And I thought, well, never in my wildest dreams did I think that I would ever have even the most passing acquaintance with anybody who had that kind of money to give away. And by the looks on your faces, you were well impressed too. So that led me naturally to read the story. Well, yes, Mr. Sheridan had given this gift, and I thought back, well, when I was babysitting for that family, they did move from Baltimore to Hanover, Pennsylvania, and Mr. Sheridan had been in the printing business, or worked for a printer in Baltimore, so maybe that's what he did in Hanover. And with the creation of the internet, I eventually looked up Hanover and, well, lo and behold, there is a printing company there called Sheridan Enterprises. Oh yes, they have been remarkably successful. Well, I thought, how wonderful Mr. Sheridan did this, for I knew that in my time he had 2 children. It happens that in preparing this sermon, I looked him up again, and he has since died, but at the age of 83, so he did have a good long life, and he had 5 children. And his obituary, which went into some detail, said that he had provided well for his children, but not so well that they didn't have to work themselves. Now, wasn't that a good gift to his children? I think it was. I think that showed both wisdom and love. And he went on, that gift to Hopkins was his first major philanthropy, but he eventually settled in Florida where he gave similar gifts to the local hospital and supported other charities as well. So, that man really understood stewardship, didn't he? And it happened too that he's a friend of Michael Bloomberg, who is also a Hopkins alumnus. Hopkins doesn't do this for all its graduates, believe me. But at any rate, that it was Michael Bloomberg who, when my long ago friend, Mr. Sheridan, were talking about making this contribution to Johns Hopkins, Mr. Sheridan was going to do it anonymously. But Bloomberg said, well, now, in the Jewish community, we encourage people to put their name on their donation, their gift, because that in itself encourages other people to make gifts. Not necessarily of $20 million, but to make gifts. Well, I just hadn't thought about it that way. But in other words, charity, philanthropy, generosity breeds more philanthropy and generosity. There's a certain sensibility about that. So Mr. Sheridan followed his friend's advice, and his name is attached to his generosity, and we hope that it has prompted others to do likewise. So I think his story is an interesting one. As I say, I never thought I would know anybody of that kind of wealth in any context. But then it also eventually occurred to me that maybe Mr. Sheridan would be surprised to know that his story is being told this morning by a woman priest who had been his babysitter about 40 years ago, over 40 years ago. So there you are. But life is full of, well, coincidence or God incidents that bear fruit. For nobody amasses a fortune by oneself. Just as the crop is the product of the grace of God and the work of many hands, so everything is. For we all inherit a great deal, not necessarily money, but just our life experience, the people we've known, the people who have nurtured us, the history that we know, the technology, the medicine that we benefit from, all of that has been handed down in one way or another, and including our relationships with people and our own spiritual nurture that is greatly influenced by the church and by other people. And so we benefit from all of that. We are the work, literally, of many influences, many people. And it is our joy, too, to sort it out, the good from the bad. Well, we have stories about wheat and chaff, do we not? Well, we do that in the course of our lifetime, too. And so that is another gift, to be given the guidance for making those kinds of choices. And we increasingly become aware of our own place in that pattern, that we have received and we also give, that we are generous in how we also form and shape and contribute to the lives of others. For ultimately, we embrace God as creator and redeemer and sustainer, and know that our response is gratitude and the desire to do the same For we are called, as the letter to the Colossians tells us, to live in the pattern of Christ, that we may be hidden with Christ, so to speak, and give to others, and at the end, we will be known as being in the body of Christ. All of that love, that giving, that serving others, is characteristic of a wealthy life, a life that is given out of a sense of plenty and blessing, not out of limitation. So we cherish that, and we then understand what it means to be rich toward God, to share whatever we've been given to share ourselves, our life, our love, our joy in God, in Jesus Christ, and in the world. Our gratitude for rain, because we are so grateful for sunshine as well.
Amen.